Plato, ancient Greek philosopher. Magento is directed here. For other uses, see Platon, disambiguation, page. Plato or Plato, Greek, Platon, 428–427 BC or 424–423 to 348–347, ancient Greek philosopher and sage. Practical information, full name. Platon, which is one of the first institutions at the university level in the world, and gives these institutions its name today, and constituted a turning point in the history of thought, laid the foundations of many discussions in the history of philosophy and science, not only sciences, but also many religions such as Christianity and Islam. Also deeply affected, together with his teacher Socrates and his student Aristotle. He is the most influential name in the history of philosophy, and much of his claims are still important, debated and contribute to most thoughts. British mathematician and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead said, "The most reliable general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of Plato's footnotes." Contrary to their contemporaries, Plato, whose works have remained presumably present, is often composed of characters from his own environment, or important to himself, set in a specific place and time, where people are arguing around and trying to refute or prove his claims by giving arguments against each other, including fictional dialogues that are very close to theatrical texts. These dialogues, the main characters of which are Socrates, differ greatly in terms of length, subject and processing. For this reason, in these texts in which Plato handles different fields such as ethics, aesthetics, metaphysics, politics, it is thought that many thoughts are repeatedly evaluated, changed or reconsidered their thoughts, the chronology of the dialogues, how they should be interpreted, what claims Plato himself advocates, or whether Plato had any thoughts in his dialogues has been the subject of debate and remains. Plato, who is considered to be the founder of political philosophy, is the truth theory, which is the universal truth that he claims can only be known through reason, the claim that the soul has three parts of mind, emotions and desires, and a harmony must be established between these parts based on the management of the mind, and on these theories. Throughout his history, his ethical and political thoughts have been very influential in discussions about mind, spirit, body, divisions, morality and the state. Plato, whose dialogues which are most frequently read and thought to explain most of his basic thoughts, state, Socrates' defense, Phaedon, Solon, Theaetetus, Menon, Parmenides, Protagoras and Timaeus, also rebutted those people by whom the original Socrates spoke about his subject. Their entertaining dialogues, which depict the process of self-questioning and thus leading to philosophy, have been very popular throughout history. Although Plato's texts, which were influenced by philosophers such as Heraclite, Parmenides, and Pythagoras, who came before him, as well as those of these philosophers, at the same time testify to these philosophers, they should be remembered that the texts of Plato are fictional texts. Although Plato's dialogue on love called Solon and other dialogues have various claims about it, none of them correspond to Platonic love as it is today. The term Platonic love has gained the meaning of romantic or sexual unexpected love today, since Plato claims that truth, beauty and good are reached in a spiritual way, not by turning towards true love with bodily pleasures. It does not oppose relationships. Vital there are virtually no sources of Plato's life, and many rumors are based on Diogenes Laertius, who wrote the biography of many philosophers in the 3rd century, that is, 5 centuries after Plato died. Diogenes Laertius states that Plato's real name is Aristotle, the name of his grandfather. Plato is a good wrestler, and the name Plato, which means wide, is a nickname he wears for his wrestling teacher's chest, shoulders, chin, or forehead. Seneca, who lived in the 1st century after Christ, says that this nickname was given to him because Plato's chest was wide. The name Plato was a common name at that time. But even if it was nicknamed, Plato wrote all his works with this name, and it was recently claimed that the name Aristotle, which means the most prestigious, was made up by biographers and was the real name of Plato. Diogenes Laertius placed Plato's date of birth according to his own estimates in 428-7, but today it is thought that he should have been born at 424 based on Plato's seventh letter. Plato, who comes from a well-established and noble family of the city of Athens, is said to have written theatre plays in his youth. Wrestling was a widespread activity among wealthy young men at that time. A very important and very popular theatre festival was held every year in the city of Athens. Plato, who was not involved in politics, probably spent his whole life spending his family's assets on philosophy. While he was a student of Socrates, one of the most influential figures in the thought world of Athens, Socrates was found guilty by the state of Athens and killed when Plato was approximately 25 years old. Plato's defense of Socrates describes the speech he made in the case when Socrates' death was decided, but Socrates in this speech neither defends himself or apologizes, but only tells his own thoughts about the charges against him. Plato, whose father is Ariston, his mother is Perictian, has two brothers, Adeimantus and Glaucon, and a sister named Potone, in which the state book is the main characters of the debate. After his sister's son Speusippus Plato died, he became the head of the academy. Plato's mother Periction's brother Charmides, who speaks in Plato's Charmides, Feast and Protagoras dialogues, and her grandfather Critias, who speaks in Charmides and Protagoras, introduces Blaius Calliscrus's son, that is, his mother's grandfather. But Timaeus and Critias, it may be thought that he mentioned another Critias because he did not introduce them in his dialogues and depicts the elderly, 30 Tirana figures are important figures in Athens policy. Critias, who is also close to Socrates, took a leading role in this period and gathered a lot of reaction from the people of Athens, so Socrates' death sentence was considered by historians as a reaction to important political figures around Socrates. Plato's life coincided with considerable changes, both for Athens and the entire ancient Greek civilization. Ancient Greek civilization spread to both sides of the Aegean Sea, Marmara and Black Sea coasts, Sicily and southern Italy in the 5th century BC, and began to be quite effective in the eastern Mediterranean coasts. In this process, Athens and Sparta rose as economic and political powers, and after a while entered the Peloponnesian War, which lasted between 431–404 BC. While Athens was managing itself with a system emphasizing social equality and legal justice, enjoining a method close to a method we can call direct democracy, Sparta had an oligarchy based on a strict class distinction between nobles and slaves. The city of Athens, which was a very effective imperialist power at the beginning of the war, was defeated by Sparta during the war, brought 30 Tirana to the Athens administration with the force of Sparta. The executions and pressures applied during this period were overthrown by rebellion 8 months later, and this time the execution of 30 Tirana and its followers caused to be. Historians think that Socrates was also killed during this period due to his relationship with hated figures such as Alcibiades, who caused great losses for Athens in the Peloponnese War, and Critias, who were influential in 30 Tirana. Plato, like the children of wealthy families of the period, must have grown up by studying grammar, music and sports, but grammar and music education of that period included today's music, poetry, grammar, literature, history, as well as physical education, as well as war practices, as well as the Olympic Games of sports competitions. The festivals of poetry and theatre performance competitions were important parts of the cultural life of ancient Greek civilization, and Athens was the leader in science, art and culture during Plato's life. It is also believed that Plato made 2 important trips throughout his life. Plato, although it was assumed that he was influenced by the philosophy of Pythagoras and Parmenides, who were influenced there in Greek cities in Sicily and southern Italy on his first trip, and that he was influenced by the understanding of God and creation in cosmology, astrology and Judaism, which were developed in Babylon and Egypt during his trips to Alexandria or ancient Egypt. There is no clear data on what he sees in this second trip. Plato, who is said to have completed his trips and returned to Athens at the age of 40, is thought to be related to what he saw and learned during his travels based on the estimated chronology of his works. In addition to this, although not included in the political world of Athens, according to Diogenes Laertius, he went to Dionysius, the ruler of Syracuse, an important Greek city of Sicily, and was a student of Dionysius's beach brother Dion Platon. But the tyrant Dionysius, when he opposed Plato, Plato was sold as a slave and was liberated and sent back to Athens by Anicetus, who knew him. According to Plato's seventh letter, Dion, who took over after Dionysius died, called Plato again to train his heir to Dionysius and make him a philosopher king in accordance with Plato's teachings. But Dionysius doubted Dion and exiled him, and sent Plato forcibly, and finally Plato left Syracuse. Therefore, Plato seems not to be disconnected from the active politics of his own time, or even because of his ties to politics, and seems to be someone who knows the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern cultures of his time. In this respect, Plato is one of the rare philosophers, not only in terms of the spectrum and depth of his thoughts, but also at least in terms of having the opportunity to put his political philosophy into practice. Plato, who presumably established the school in the academy after completing his travels, continued his philosophical and scientific discussions with many important people in Athens of the period and wrote many of his original thoughts. When Plato was in his 60s, Aristotle, 17, came to Plato's school and was here for 20 years. On the one hand, Aristotle had a very different philosophy with Plato, criticizing Plato in many points in the texts, problems with many points of Plato's thought. On the other hand, some claims in Plato's last period were distanced or different from their previous texts. May think that there is a productive dialogue between Plato and Aristotle despite the age difference between them. Plato died in his early 80s, when he was replaced by his nephew. He left Aristotle Academy, and later established his own school in Athens Lyceum. This name is also the source of the word high school today. Plato's works can be divided chronologically into three groups. First, Defense of Socrates, Charmides, Crito, Euthyphro, Gorgias, Hippias, Minor, Hippias, Major, Ion, Laches, Lysis, Protagoras Medium, Cratylus, Euthydemus, Meno, Parmenides, Phaedon, Phaedrus, State, Feast, Theaetetus and Critias, Sophist, Statesman, Timaeus, Philebus, Laws. However, the facts that enable us to make this distinction are only the inferences made by linguists by looking at the common features of Plato's language use and interpretations of the changes and developments in the content of the works. Others also see a transition period between the first and the middle terms. Others refuse to try to make such a distinction and argue that Plato's works should be seen as a whole. Until recently, the chronology of the works was not even cared for, and they were assumed that they were not fictional and conveyed the events. The text printed by Henricus Stephanus, which was published in the 16th century, with the interpretation of all of Plato's works, and many other dialogues attributed to Plato but later proved to be absent, is used today to determine the reference numbers of the lines in Plato's texts. The works that were called as the first period were sent to someone who Socrates accepted as an authority on the subject or saw himself as an authority. It mostly describes the process of asking the meanings of the concepts of morality, testing the various answers by logically refuting, and finally showing that the person he speaks with does not know the answer. These not too long dialogues are mostly lively texts that are very close to the theatre, as they consist of short question and answer sentences and contain many jokes and references. Socrates, who claims that he only asks questions and does not make a positive claim, claims that he does not know anything either, and contradicts the claims of the other party who claims to know something. These dialogues are thought to be close to the debates Socrates really made in Athens and his philosophical attitude. The method of asking a person to tell him that he contradicts himself is called the Socratic method. It is said that most of these dialogues end with aporia, which means not knowing what to say in ancient Greek, since it ends at a clear point where a final answer cannot be found. He thinks that the works devoted to the middle period wrote after he developed Plato's theory of ideas, or forms, and especially after studying the ideas of Pythagoras, Heraclitus and Parmenides. Even though Socrates is the main character in this period, the texts that are much longer are texts in which a view is advocated or tried to be proved, and which is tried to be understood by discussing different thoughts. Although Theaetetus starts with the question what is knowledge and ends with aporia after examining various claims, Socrates gives many arguments during this time that can be interpreted as positive claims. Parmenides' dialogue continues with a long section with different interpretations, after Parmenides' refutation of Socrates. In contrast to the first period, the person whose original thoughts were refuted or questioned in Phaedon, the state and Parmenides, or expected to be proved, is the character of Socrates, but it is believed that Plato did not reflect the real Socrates, but Plato's own ideas. The state, Phaedon, Solon and Meno, one of Plato's most famous works, are in this period. In his recent works, Plato has thoroughly diverged from the dialogue format, although he has characters and a scene, and has written dialogues with rather complex arguments and claims, consisting of continuous long conversations approaching the monologue. How to interpret his works such as Timaeus, Sophist, Giant's Man and Laws and his relationship with medium-term works is still a matter of debate today. Especially the ontological, metaphysical and cosmological arguments he developed in Timaeus were very influential in the history of philosophy and science, and until the Renaissance, Plato's only known work was Timaeus. Although Plato reveals much more advanced theories in these late period works by reconsidering most of the topics he deals with in his medium works, these texts are not as popular today as Plato's medium works. Although the handling of the subjects varies, the characters, the place and the time the events take place, the reactions of the characters in the atmosphere of the debates are part of the arguments in all of Plato's works, so Plato's dialogues should be read as literary works of art rather than just philosophical proofs, and Plato's philosophy should be interpreted with this perspective in mind. Idea theory. Plato's philosophy is mainly based on the distinction between what is perceived and explained by Phaedon, saying that the object of knowledge, that is, what we can know, can only be thought. Plato claims that what we perceive can only be the object of opinion, and thought. He thinks that everything we perceive by being influenced by Heraclitus is constantly changing, but knowledge must be a constant thing, so that knowledge can only be achieved in thought. Perhaps the most influential and most important theory, he never wrote the theory of ideas exactly as the main topic of discussion in his works. He assumed that he existed in some of his works, such as Phaedon and the State, contained claims about what ideas might not be in the Parmenides dialogue, after his midterm works. He clearly spoke of ideas in very few places, but he never seems to have given up on his belief in the existence of ideas. Therefore, it can be assumed that Plato considered the theory of ideas as an incomplete, open-ended theory with many sides waiting to be explored, as a kind of philosophical project or question. Ancient Greek idea eidos means appearing, and in addition, there are meanings of form, type. In the State book, Plato claims that we see many things that are beautiful, that there is something common in them, and how beautiful these objects are, while the beauty that is common in them is the unchanging, absolute and literally beautiful, the beauty itself. In this sense, ideas are the objects of absolute unchanging thought that give the objects we perceive the properties we perceive, which are the ones of those properties. When the objects we perceive have a feature, they participate in the ideas of that feature, take a share from it, methakin. However, even though Plato did not give a theory about what this participation is metaphysically like, the part in Timaeus explaining how qualities are formed can be seen as an indirect answer to this question. In Timaeus dialogue, qualities are explained based on the geometric properties of more basic elements, and since demiurgos, which determines all forms of occurrence of basic elements, namely artist, craftsman, or creative existence, by looking at existence, that is, by ideas. All the quantities that appear in the objects we perceive are ideas in the process of demigos. It is the reflection of the particular existence that he created by looking into our perception. Plato thinks of ideas as the absolute standard in which a feature is measured. In a sense, although it does not seem to make a positive claim in the early dialogues, Socrates said, "What is it?" While asking for an answer to the question, he expects universal definitions and tries to reach universal expressions that contain all objects of a concept. In this respect, it has been suggested that the theory of ideas could belong to Socrates, or that he believed a different version of Socrates' theory of ideas. The Plato, Meno and Phaedo dialogues, who claim that we know ideals by thought, not by perception, claim that we do not learn the ideas after birth, but that we already possess them in our soul. But since the body is material at birth, the knowledge in the soul is forgotten, that this knowledge in the soul can be remembered through philosophy again. Ironically, Plato, the founder of the first university in history, says that education in the sense of transferring knowledge is impossible. Knowledge is not something transferred, but revealing and remembering the ideas already in the soul. He says that the philosophical process in the state dialogue is dialectical, that is, debate in the sense of the word, and that it is the process of reaching a basic and non-hypothetical reality by comparing different hypotheses. This non-hypothetical fact is the idea that is the cause of all other reality. However, it is not clear what it is like to achieve ideas. Plato assumes them and various features related to them, rather than telling them what the ideals are. While talking about love in the feast dialogue, he described how to reach love ideas in 4 stages. First, as a lover, we recognize love that is perceived by particular and perception. Then we understand what general perceptual love is by looking at other forms of this particular perceptual love in other people. Then we reach the intellectual and general love by abstracting general love. By researching this intellectual and general love, we finally reach a single love that dominates the whole general. Here is the true love that determines how all love will be, visible in all situations of love, but remains unchanged, love itself. In the state dialogue, ideas are explained both as the reason that objects have a property and the reason for our knowledge about it, so that something can only be true by the ideas. Some call Plato an idealist because it bases truth on intellectual objects, while others say it is realist because it claims that universal features exist outside our minds. Plato has been interpreted by many as claiming the existence of a third world, in addition to the perceptual and mental world, as the world of ideas because he claims that ideals cannot be grasped with perception. But this interpretation is false because Plato does not claim that there are space-occupying objects in space. Moreover, it does not claim that the perceptual and mental things are 2 separate worlds, and vice versa. It only mentions one universe intimus. Ideals are perfect beings that are not physical in contrast to physical objects, and therefore do not have defects of physical objects such as changing, emerging and disappearing, or even literally. Claiming that there is a level relationship between the ideas in the state dialogue, Plato claims that his good ideas should be at the top and even beyond being, because it is his good ideas that the being is being. Evidence of this claim is one of Plato's most fundamental questions of metaphysics: why is there something rather than nothing? The answer to the question is, there is something because something exists is better than nothing, so the reason why existence exists instead of nothing is its good idea. Since the good idea is the basic idea that determines everything else, all the ideas and the whole being are good. Plato aims to produce solutions to many problems raised by sophists who were popular in his time while putting forward ideas. One of these problems is how a property can be in more than one object. The meaning of the universals in the sense of properties attributable to more than one object has become the subject of philosophy with Plato's theory of ideas. In addition, the sophists show many false claims as true with rhetoric, that is, convincing speech methods. Plato claims that the truth will come to ideals on the basis of logic. In addition, thanks to the theory of ideas, Plato was able to claim that not only physical properties, but also moral and aesthetic concepts were universal, and were able to discuss what universal moral laws or beauty could be. In this sense, Plato tries to solve a lot of problems with his theory of ideas. That his theory never presents a finished version may depend on this effort. Plato's answer to the question of what is idea seems to be the real thing. That ideals are things that are independent of time and space, universal, perfect, absolute, unchanging, not emerging or disappearing, but only exist, but that they can only be known through abstract thought, pure reason, and that they are the cause of everything that is grasped with the perception in existence. He said. But the interpretation of his ideas as a kind of other world or realm of spirits stems from the spirit and universe understanding of Christian and Islamic beliefs that became widespread in the Middle Ages. Even though ideals are abstract objects, they are not mental objects, so they cannot be imagined, mentally visualized in this sense. It seems that according to Plato they can only be thought, known and said. So although Plato is open to interpretation of how mental he is talking about, many people in history have interpreted ideas as objects constructed in the mind, so that Plato claims that the truth will be understood only through what is inside the mind, or that the whole reality is within the mind. They concluded, some supported this result, some criticized it. What Plato really says is still open to interpretation, and one of the important questions that drag the history of philosophy appears. Spirit. The spirit, consisting of three parts that Plato depicts in the State Dialogue, has been the basis for many thoughts trying to make sense of human nature throughout history. Plato says that the soul is made up of mind, emotions and desires, but the meanings of these words have slightly different meanings in his terminology. The word used by Plato for the soul is actually more what gives life, and for the first time Plato argued that mind is something originating from life. Before that, the mind was thought to be more related to heart, emotions. Moreover, for the first time, Plato tried to prove that the soul was immortal by placing such detailed arguments. Therefore, in Plato, and perhaps until the late antiquity, the soul should not be considered as a kind of ghost, but should be evaluated to include the concepts of life, vitality, source of vitality, self, immortality of the spirit. Phaedo Dialogue tells about the last moments with his relatives in the hours just before he was sentenced to death by drinking poison after Socrates was sentenced to death. The subject of the debate is the immortality of the soul, because Socrates, who believes that the soul is immortal, and that death is not to die, is not at all upset about his death, and also rejects his friends' offers to save him and escape to another city. Their friends also ask Socrates how he can be so sure of the immortality of the soul. Socrates says that he believes in the existence of ideas, that all his thought is based on it. The soul is not perceptual, like ideas, it is something in thought, it does not change like ideals, it is absolute and perfect, therefore it must be independent of time and space, therefore there should be no birth and death. Third argument of similarity. Also, if the soul is life-giving, how can the life-giving itself die without being alive? The deceased is the body, but the body is always dead and always disintegrating and disintegrating. The soul is always alive and always one. The first argument, the cyclical or opposite argument. Also, it is possible for us to know something because that information already exists in our soul, or we could not even know if something we found was information. This is the information paradox discussed in the Meno dialogue. In order for us to access information, the truth must exist before we are born in our soul. It must always exist with information. Second argument, remembering argument. In fact, the course of the dialogue is more than just asking his friends to question what they want to hear from him before he dies, rather than asking him about the last time he wants to hear from Socrates, or they are trying to explain the things he always likes to tell. Philosopher Aesthetic references external links about this item. View Edit History View Discussion page. Discuss the improvements in this article. Read more. Content is available under CC BY SA 3.0 license unless otherwise stated. View item in browser.